Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the November installment of our Wilder School Lunch and Learn series 2021 Virginia Elections Analysis and What's Ahead. My name is Stevan Dozier, and I am the Director of Development and Alumni Engagement for the Wilder School. I am happy to be here with you all this afternoon, and I'm going to share a few notes and updates about the school before we get started. First, our Master of Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness program, we're proud to say is ranked third in the nation by academic influence. Next, our Master of Urban and Regional Planning program receives its accreditation renewal, a 7-year term. We're very excited for this by the Planning Accreditation Board. We want to direct everyone's attention to the Wilder School magazine, which is now available online and in print, with a special attention to the Leading with Urgency section of this magazine, which celebrates our fearless leader, Dean Susan Gooden, who will be coming up next. And for 2022, please mark your calendars for noon Thursday at April 27th for the Excellence in Virginia Government Awards. That is a great event each year, and this will be our 15th event, so we're really excited for that. And lastly, join our newsletter, Policy Bites. We are continuing to drive conversation and inform research, and we would love for everyone to be a part of that conversation. So you can subscribe at that link below. Next up, we have Dean Susan Gooden.
Thanks so much, Stevan, and welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you have decided to join us for today's Lunch and Learn, which I know is going to be outstanding. We will hear in a moment from Dr. Bob Holsworth, who has one of the best political knowledge skill sets, particularly when it comes to elections and Virginia politics. So I know we're going to learn a lot today, and I'm looking forward to that. I wouldn't be doing my role as dean if I didn't brag a little bit on the Wilder School. Certainly, Stevan has mentioned a lot of those accomplishments. We're very proud of the rankings and the reaccreditation of our MERP program. Very excited about that. I also will say a little closer to today's topic is that our Commonwealth poll, which is a CNN, which was a CNN featured poll in the 2020 elections, was the first poll to show the tightening of the race, the gubernatorial race that preceded where we are today. So we're proud that that poll taps into the perspectives of Virginians, and we look forward to continuing to share that and to be able to share the public opinions of Virginians, and hope that this information is helpful to policymakers and to academics and to researchers and our students alike. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's session, who is Paula Otto. She is a highly valued member of the Wilder School team, and she serves as Senior Director of Special Projects, but Paula does a lot more. She leads our Excellence in Virginia Government Awards luncheon that Stevan mentioned, and she has an impressive pedigree all of her own. She has been the executive director of the Virginia Lottery. She still won't give up those lottery numbers though, and she is just a tremendously valued and respected colleague and friend. So I can think of no one better to moderate today's session than Paula. Paula, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Dean Gooden. And we are so pleased today to welcome back Dr. Bob Holsworth. He is certainly very well known throughout the Commonwealth for his decades of political commentary and analysis. During this past election cycle, he was frequently tapped by political reporters and served as the election night expert for the Richmond CBS affiliate WTVR-TV. And on a personal note, Dr. Holsworth and I met when I was a young political reporter here in Richmond many years ago, and I always looked to him to help me understand the elections. Dr. Holsworth is the founding director of the VCU Center for Public Policy and the L. Douglas Wilder School of Government and Public Affairs. He also served as dean of the VCU College of Humanities and Sciences and served 2 terms on the VCU Board of Visitors. Dr. Holsworth is now a managing partner at Decide Smart, and we are just delighted to have him with us for today's Lunch and Learn. We encourage you to use the chat feature, and if you have a question for Dr. Holsworth, if you will enter that in the Q&A feature. Dr. Holsworth, we look forward to the conversation.
Paula and Susan, thanks very much. It's great to be with everybody today, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'll have a few comments to begin with on what happened a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, why it happened from my point of view, and where we may go going forward. And then I'd love to hear any questions or comments that people have. In terms of what happened in the election, I have a slightly different take than most people who have been looking at it so far. And it's only because I use as a baseline in the analysis I want to present today a little bit of different baseline than most people have used. By and large, most of the commentary on the election has looked back on how this election compared with 2020 when Donald Trump ran against Joe Biden in Virginia, or 2017 when Governor Northam ran. And those are reasonable things to do, and they're reasonable ways of looking at what happened. And I don't have much objection to most of the analyses that have been grounded in that particular perspective. But I think if we want to understand a couple of things, particularly the long-term trends in Virginia politics, it's best not to actually use the Trump years as the baseline, because from my perspective, there was kind of an over-exaggeration, a negative reaction that occurred not to Donald Trump in Virginia that kind of exaggerated or over-exaggerated the political trends that were occurring here. So in order to try to sort of, you might say, find some way of qualifying for that, or what I've tried to do is to go back and look at the first time Terry McAuliffe ran for governor and won in 2013 and compare the 2013 election, which he won, to the 2021 election, which he lost. And what you see there is that in 2013, he won by 2.5 points. And in 2021, he lost by slightly over 2 points. So what occurred in Virginia between 2013 and 2021 that made Terry McAuliffe lose and allowed Glenn Youngkin to win the other week? And then secondly, when we do that, I think we see that some of the commentary on the election may be a bit misplaced, and we might want to look at the reasons that Youngkin won and Terry McAuliffe lost just slightly differently than if we simply use the Trump era as the baseline. So let me start with this. If I had told you that Terry McAuliffe had won election in 2013 in a race against Ken Cuccinelli, the Republican candidate who was not particularly perceived to be a strong candidate, by 2.5 points, and there was a third-party candidate in the race. And if I had told you that in 2021, Terry McAuliffe was going to carry Fairfax County by 8 points higher than he did in 2013 against Cuccinelli, that in fact, Ken Cuccinelli was going to get a higher percentage of the vote in Fairfax County in a 3-way race than Glenn Youngkin did in a 2-way race, that Terry McAuliffe was going to more than double his margin in Loudoun County from 2013 to 2021, that he was going to essentially double his margin in Prince William County, going from 8 points to 15 points. In Loudoun, he went from 4.5 points to 11 in 2021, that he was going to increase his margins in Arlington and Alexandria, that he was going to increase his margin in Henrico County, that he was going to increase his margin in the city of Richmond, and that he was going to lose Chesterfield County by less votes by less percentage points than he did in 2013, I think almost all of you would have put your money on Terry McAuliffe if you said that was going to happen. And so my point essentially is that if you take a look at this race, it wasn't a suburban swing in Nova or a suburban swing in RVA that cost the Democrats the election at all. Indeed, I would argue that it didn't happen to a great degree at all. That in fact, it's only when you look at sort of this Trump baseline that you can begin to make that argument. If you read, I often said, if you looked at Fox News, you would have thought that Loudoun County was the center of the political universe. And what you found there again was that Ken Cuccinelli, in losing to Terry McAuliffe, got a higher percentage in a three-way race than Glenn Youngkin did in a two-way race. So my sense is that Nova and RVA really were pretty much the same, and in fact trended toward the Democrats if you look back from 2013. Indeed, some people would say, well, it was the turnout in these areas that were really different. And I looked at that and it wasn't. Actually, all those localities that I just mentioned comprised a higher percentage of the vote in 2021 than they did in 2013, when Terry McAuliffe won by 2.5 points. And I think that analysis is also confirmed by what happened in the General Assembly races. There's not a single Republican that won in Fairfax County in the House of Delegates, not a single one that won in Prince William County. One Republican who represented part of Loudoun, Dave LaRock, kept his seat, but they didn't take any other Democratic seat in Loudoun County. And in fact, those races in 2021 looked almost equally like they did in 2019. The one seat that the Republicans did pick up in Northern Virginia, they picked up in Stafford County, an outer suburb, and they picked up a seat that the former Speaker of the House, Bill Howell, a Republican, had held for many years. And the Democrats actually won that seat in 2019 because the Republicans nominated an individual who had a fairly significant criminal background record for their nominee. And the Democrats were able to squeak by in 2019, lost that seat in 21. So, and the same thing happened actually in RVA. In Western Henrico, for example, where some people talked about there's going to be this great suburban swing. Schuyler Van Valkenburg and Rodney Willett both held on to their seats with the exact same percentage that they had in 2019. So if you want to take a look at why Terry McAuliffe lost, Nova and RVA weren't the reasons. My argument is that you would basically have to look at what I call ROVA, the rest of Virginia. And there were two particular elements here that were really important. The first is that the Hampton Roads, both the suburbs and the cities, looked a lot different than RVA and Nova, where Terry McAuliffe ran actually stronger in RVA and Nova than he did in 2013. He ran far behind how he did in 2013 in Hampton Roads, not only in Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, Poquoson, but also the cities of Newport News and Norfolk and Hampton. He ran worse in 2013 than he did in 2021. Perhaps the reason for that was low turnout in some heavily African-American areas, but maybe a larger reason was and I'll talk about this in a moment, the military issues that resulted from the Afghanistan withdrawal and the sense that Hampton Roads is a heavily military-oriented community. That could have been the case as well. But in any event, that was one big problem for the Democrats, that Hampton Roads, both in turnout and performance, was far lower than the other two metropolitan areas and very different than 2013. The second issue, as I call it, with the rest of Virginia, which is the Shenandoah Valley, the suburbs around Liberty University outside of Lynchburg, Campbell and Bedford County, and then up through Roanoke County and Botetourt County, and then finally in the rural areas of South Side and Southwest, especially where there were not significant African-American populations, the Democrats just cratered, and they cratered in an unbelievable way. For places where they were getting 32, 33% of the vote 8 years ago, they're now getting 17, 18, 19% of the vote. And so what you saw was this just extraordinary sort of shift, you might say, even further to the Republican side. And this is where I think many of those of us who observe Virginia politics didn't understand that it could get even worse than it had been for the Democrats. Democrats had been losing these areas by large margins. They were losing them 68-32, 70-30, sometimes 75-25. And many of us thought there were simply no more Republican votes left to harvest in these areas, that the Democrats had hit bottom. But as what often occurs in life, when you think you may have hit bottom, you find out you really haven't. This is what occurred, that the bottom just seemed to open up even further for the Democrats, and the combination of extraordinarily poor performance and unusually high turnout in these more rural areas, along with, as I said, the Liberty suburbs, combined with what happened in Hampton Roads, was enough to win the election for Glenn Youngkin. If you look at some of the exit polls to the election, what you find is that Youngkin did, that McAuliffe did about as well as Biden almost, with individuals with college or postgraduate education, which leads to, again, confirm the thesis I have about Northern Virginia and RVA, which are the two most highly educated areas of the state. But at the same time, particularly among white voters without college degrees, again, the bottom fell out. McAuliffe, according to the exit polls, got 24%. And what was most important about that was that that had been an issue that had been impacting the Democrats, especially with white men without college degrees. In this election, it also manifested with white women without college degrees, where Biden supposedly, according to the exit poll, got 44% of that vote in Virginia, and McAuliffe got 25% of that vote. So ultimately, that combination of Hampton Roads, serious decline, major decline throughout the rest of Virginia, was not able for the Democrats to overcome the advantages they continued to have by and large in Northern Virginia and in RVA, for the most part, where they ran pretty well on that front. Now, why did all this happen? One argument I think that makes some sense and certainly had an impact was the national environment. When Joe Biden was cruising in the polls and had a 55% approval rating in July, things looked a lot better for the Democrats. As Biden's approval rating cratered, especially among independents, you saw McAuliffe's numbers decline significantly among independents as well. So that was, I think, a major factor. And it's hard to minimize that if you look at what also happened in New Jersey, where Phil Murphy, in a state that Biden won by 16, compared to Virginia, where he won by 10, also wound up in a nail biter of an election on that front. So obviously, the national environment impacted, I think, what we had here in Virginia as well. Secondly, I might say that I think that the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic probably had more influence than a lot of folks had thought previously. And that occurred, I think, because there was, in some ways, a shift away from the issues of vaccine mandates and vaccine and mask mandates that looked as if it was going to play to the Democrats' favor in July and August. But as the COVID situation got a little better in Virginia, those issues weren't as prominent. But at the same time, I think the overall impact of the pandemic and some of the consequences started to emerge in ways that played against the Democrats and played to the Republican favor. And we can talk about this in the conversation, but certainly I think this year of remote learning, remote education, frustrated parents tremendously. I think it frustrated, if you look at some of the data that I presented earlier about women abandoning the Democrats, I think some of these folks were hit most hardest by the pandemic, and were just frustrated and looking for a different alternative in that sense. And so that could have had a significant impact as well, I think, on that front. If you look at the campaigns per se, certainly Youngkin turned out to be, which I thought he would be, the best Republican candidate of the ones they could have chosen. He was telegenic, he had a ton of resources, and he managed to walk this tightrope between appealing to the Trump base extraordinarily effectively, did better in many of those locales actually than Trump himself did, while at the same time not antagonizing suburbanites to the point that it would become impossible for him to win. So I think he did a fairly good job there. I think the messaging of the different campaigns ultimately probably played a factor as well. McAuliffe really based his campaign on the sense that the negativity toward Trump would extend toward this election, a year after Trump was out of office. And unfortunately for the Democrats, unfortunately for the Republicans, the declining ratings of Biden probably had far more of an impact in this election than ultimately people's perceptions about Trump. There's been a lot of talk about education issues in this campaign and what that mattered, and the parents matter argument. And that's an interesting one to try to ferret out. Neither of the campaigns actually felt at the end that that was the decisive factor in the campaign, that they didn't believe that. But by and large, a lot of folks did. My sense is that the problem for the Democrats here is that there had been a more generalized frustration with education going on for the last 15 months since the pandemic. And with the problems of remote learning, many places not even having great internet connections, parents frustrated with kids on Zoom for 6 and 8 hours. And this was something that the Republican message seemed to speak to better than the Democratic message, which hardly recognized that that was an issue. And then finally on the economy, which a lot of people ultimately spoke as a major, major issue in the campaign, what you saw was that issue shifted from early summer to late fall. And it shifted in this way, that prior to that time, most folks were saying they felt that the Democrats could handle the economy better. But what occurred, I believe, coming into September and October, is that inflation and the cost of goods became a more pressing issue to many people in the Commonwealth, as it has in the country. And there is a very negative reaction to high inflation and the price of goods going up, people paying more every time they fill up a gas tank, go to the grocery store, seeing prices that they hadn't seen in a decade or more on this front. And by and large, I think Glenn Youngkin spoke at least a little bit to this with his notion of eliminating the grocery tax. And at the same time, the Democrats Terry McAuliffe almost didn't mention it, didn't act as if it was a serious issue to people. And I think that probably harmed what the Democrats felt was going to be an initial advantage on the economic performance in Virginia, was that they didn't have anything to say about the issue that people were beginning to feel was putting excess stress on their lives in that front there. Finally, I might add that One sort of open question in this is, what was the role of race in this campaign? There are a number of Democrats who felt that the issue of critical race theory was somewhat of a dog whistle, that a lot of folks felt that critical race theory in Loudoun County was going to be this huge issue. As I said, I don't think it had much of an impact in Loudoun County, where McAuliffe won handily by 11 points. At the same time, it might have had a greater issue in sort of reinforcing cultural norms outside of Loudoun County. And clearly, the Democratic performance among white voters in the rural areas is an issue that continues to bedevil the Democrats. And the question is, what's the reason for that? Is it an economic reason? How do they address it? Or is it a reason that is, as some people have suggested, simply a division that has occurred across racial lines and one that won't be easily addressed or solved on that front? Finally, what we can see going forward here, before I take some of your questions, for Glenn Youngkin, the governor, I think the big choice he's going to have to make, or the first choice, is he going to be a Virginia governor in a Virginia tradition, or is he going to be a governor in the tradition of the new Republican Party, which, even though he is out of office, is still, I think, a Trump party by and large. And that is going to be an issue that he negotiated pretty well in the campaign, but he's going to have to continue to negotiate it. And I was fascinated the other day when he came out and he said that he wouldn't, as he had said in the campaign, he wants to remove all state mandated mask or vaccine mandates. But at the same time, he said, as he did at a couple of moments in the campaign, that he would support local option in this. So if the Fairfax County School Board, the Prince William County School Board wants to maintain a mask mandate, he's not going to say anything about it. And the interesting feature to me on that, for example, will be, how does his base constituency react? The people who supported him because he was against the mask mandates. And what happens when a couple of hundred of them show up at a school board meeting to protest a continuation of a mask mandate? And I think there's any number of issues where Youngkin's going to have to continue to walk that line, except now as governor, he's going to have to make choices, and it'll be fascinating to see how folks look at those choices. In terms of the tax policies that he put forward, I think a couple of them are likely to come to fruition here. The elimination of the grocery tax, the last elimination of the grocery tax, appears to me that the state does have enough money now to ensure that the localities that get a portion of that remain whole if they want to. And indeed, interestingly enough, that had traditionally been a Democratic idea, because it was the Democrats who had traditionally said that the grocery tax was regressive because it unfairly penalized poor people who spent more of their money on groceries than rich people. So my guess is that Youngkin should be able to gain enough Democratic support for that. He might also be able to gain enough support for rebating at least part of the growing surplus that we're seeing in Virginia to individuals and families. I think his policy of proposing to suspend the gas tax increase for a year, even with gasoline prices going up, that may be a tougher sell or harder sledding, largely because that could put some transportation projects on hold. And I'm not sure that all Republicans would support that in the General Assembly. Finally, Youngkin, it'll be fascinating to see what he does on education. I think he'll probably follow through on his promise to put more dollars into HBCUs, but at the same time, how he handles critical race theory and this whole notion of how Virginia ought to teach about its past and whether or not systemic racism ought to be mentioned in the schools, that is going to be interesting. And then we have a whole set of issues, I think, that are going to be about the guidance in school systems regarding transgender policy that I think will going to come up in the school system after school system as well. And so what we're seeing, and that I think is not going to go away, was a real politicization of K-12 education in this campaign. I think that the culture war has now been brought down from universities to K-12 education. And interestingly enough, I think that school board elections are likely to be a place where you're going to see far more politicization of school board elections over the next couple of years than one could have imagined previously, where by and large you were talking about parents who'd been involved in PTAs and people who had particular educational backgrounds involved in school boards. I think now what we're going to see is that local school board elections are going to be the next place where the culture war is going to be fought out in that front. Finally, just a few thoughts on the Assembly. The House and the Senate are under different party control right now. The Republicans have 52-48 advantage in the House. They won 3 seats in Hampton Roads, the place I said where they won the most. They won 2 seats in clearly rural Virginia, the last 2 rural Democratic seats in the House of Delegates. They won that 1 seat I mentioned in outer Hampton Road, outer Northern Virginia, and 1 seat in Southern Chesterfield, Petersburg, and Dinwiddie, where this overwhelming vote in Dinwiddie enabled them to take La Charisse's aired seat that had previously been thought to have been centered in Petersburg on that front. But what the interesting feature is, a couple of interesting features now. First, the House and the Senate represent different regional bases in Virginia. The House is now a rural House. As I said, there's not a single member of the House of Delegates that represents Fairfax County. Their leadership comes from the Valley and Southwest Virginia. The Senate is more of a metropolitan Senate under Democratic control, 21-19, a very slim majority for them. But that is one where power is essentially centered in Northern Virginia. So you have these 2 conflicting bodies now representing very different parts of the state. The challenge for the Democrats is, can they keep their 21-19 majority in the Senate intact? Can they be this sort of bulwark against what they consider to be Republican overreach? Or is it possible that there will be, in a Democratic Senate, a version of Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema that can find a way of aligning with Republicans on certain votes? Because if there's a tie vote in the Senate now, the Republicans, because they won the lieutenant governor's race with Winston Sears, hold the tie-breaking vote. So it'll be interesting to see how the Democrats proceed on that. Finally, my last comment before I take some of your comments is that if you look at the AG's race between Mark Herring, who lost, and the new AG-elect, Jason Miyares, what you find is a sea change in Virginia, that Herring was by and large a progressive attorney general who is very much interested in promoting Democratic positions on a number of key social issues, whether it be same-sex marriage, abortion. And now we have a Republican attorney general who comes in very much with the what I would call the tough cop perspective, the law enforcement perspective that was harkens back in, for those of us who are old enough to remember, the George Allen, Jim Gilmore days of the 1990s. And it was very interesting that it's these attorney generals that I think that Miyares is going to look for advice. And given his initial comments, it's very clear that perhaps the largest change of all that we may see is how the Attorney General's office lines up on a number of key issues here in Virginia. So again, that's my take on the race, a pretty fascinating race. We have coming up in 2022, the congressional elections in Virginia. I think the Democrats rue the day now that that several of them, not all of them, actually voted for this redistricting commission that turned out to be a contraption that ultimately just kicked redistricting to the Virginia Supreme Court. And the Democrats, unlike Republicans around the country, where they are using redistricting to actually try to take control of the US Congress, House of Representatives in 2022, the Democrats did not do that. And as a result, both Elaine Luria and Abigail Spanberger are in for contests that have to be, if they look at these results last week, basically terrifying for them. So we will see those elections. And then finally, the only question there that comes up in Virginia is whether, because we did not hold this election cycle under redistricting, will the courts demand that the House of Delegates run again in 2022 before they run in 2023? So there's this somewhat of a potential, I don't know how strong, that we could actually have a House of Delegates races 3 years in a row. So I'd love to take your questions and comments now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Holsworth, for all of your insights and analysis. I am especially fascinated by your ROVA term, the rest of Virginia. And one of our first questions came from Chris Miller. And he asked, do you think that the Democratic loss this year is attributable more to the differential turnout, fewer Democrats inspired to vote, or to individual persuadable voters who swung back to the Republicans? And thank you, Chris, for that question.
Yeah, I think it's always a mix of these kind of things. Certainly, if you look at the Trump era as your baseline, there was Democratic turnout disadvantages. That, there are certain demographic groups that didn't come out. In particular, I might mention one that I didn't talk about during the conversation. That was young voters. They didn't come out at all in this election. Probably cost the Democrats a seat in the House in the Virginia Tech District in Montgomery County. But we saw that in the early vote, and we saw that on election night, that young voters didn't come out. Probably the Democratic mistake there was that the Senate last year, the Virginia Senate wanted to put marijuana legalization as a referendum on the ballot this time. And the Democratic House didn't want to do it. They wanted to play it what they called safe. They were a little worried that they might lose their rural seats, which they lost anyway. But in retrospect, particularly with young voters, that was probably a major error on the Democratic part. That would have, I think, got a lot more college students and college-age kids out to vote for the Democrats, and might have helped them in areas of the state that they weren't even thinking about, particularly in some of the rural areas. I think that would have played far better than the Democrats had thought about. So in some sense, I think you can take a look at Democratic performance among young voters, certainly in some low-income, primarily minority precincts. The Democrats had turnout that was lower than they had hoped or expected as well. There was some degree of persuadable voters, but I don't think it was that much. As I said, if I look at Western Henrico, which is where you would think the Republicans would have persuadable voters in this region right here, why did Schuyler Van Valkenburg and Rodney Willett get the exact same vote in terms of margin that they did 2 years ago? Nobody was persuaded. They spent millions of dollars. It was probably, each of those races probably spent over $2 million for an $18,000 job. No one was persuaded. Very much the same thing happened in Northern Virginia. Wendy Goditis, who represented even part of Clark County, she won by 2 points last time. She won by 1.5 this time. Every time you look at those races, you didn't see that much, except when you got down to Hampton Roads. And there was a switch. That's where I saw this combination of low Democratic turnout and some persuadable voters. Republicans, as I said, took 3 seats in the House, including one that they didn't imagine they were going to win. There was one in where Martha Mugler lost to A.C. Cordoza. Republicans didn't spend any money on A.C. Cordoza. He spent $50,000 of his own money that he raised. Martha Mugler raised over $500,000, $560,000, and lost in this race. Very much like that race in New Jersey, where one of the most prominent members of the New Jersey legislature lost to a truck driver. And we had our little version of that in Hampton Roads. So I think in different parts of the state, different things happened, but I think Hampton Roads was the place where you had the most persuadables. I think what's happened in the rural areas is that the Democrats are at, and the Republicans are at such a cultural advantage right now that politics just plays along with everything else. You have a particular view on religion, you have a particular view on abortion, you have a particular view on guns, and then you have a particular view on who you should support politically too. And the Democrats were running up such high margins in the Trump era that they didn't pay any attention to this. They didn't think it was a kind of a big issue. And I think what happened, particularly because of the loss of women voters in those areas to the Democrats, the bottom fell further down than they ever imagined it could. Or even, as I said, I thought they had reached rock bottom, and they hadn't, because what I hadn't foreseen was that there was a gender gap, even if the Democrats were still running poorly, there was a gender gap which were getting them some votes, and that disappeared in this election.
Thank you. Let's stay on money for just a moment. This was the first gubernatorial election in Virginia where the campaigns together spent more than $100 million. And we know that some of that was self-funded by Governor-elect Youngkin. What do we make of that kind of money for a statewide office?
Yeah, well, it's too much, obviously, but I don't think anyone was unprepared for that. I remember when Youngkin got the nomination, I told the TV station I worked for, it's just going to be Katie bar the door here with the money, because McAuliffe, part of the reason he may have won the Democratic nomination so easily was that people knew he had a national Rolodex and could be competitive financially there. Certainly that helped. I think there's a point of diminishing returns to money. The Democrats outraised the Republicans in almost every House of Delegates seat they lost by a considerable amount. And in fact, they're not going to have that advantage in ensuing elections when the Republicans are now the majority party in the House. But that didn't matter. So I think in elections, you need enough money to be competitive typically, A.C. Cordoza being the exception here. But you don't always need to be winning the financial race to win, because I think after there's some time where people just turn it off on that front. The second reason about that is that a lot of people now vote early, so they're not even listening to that.
Especially those last couple of weeks where
yeah,
every single commercial spot was a candidate.
Right, and that's the best way to get off all those lists. When they call you, just say that you voted early, and all of a sudden you're excluded.
A good tip. We have a couple of questions about whether or not the result in Virginia is a look into the future for 2022. And Kenneth Pope asks, does this Virginia election result mean that the Republican Party is not as beholden to Donald Trump moving forward in 2022? Many have certainly observed that the Youngkin campaign seemed to do a good job of balancing how much it embraced Donald Trump and his endorsement and how much it remained independent.
It's a great point and a great question. On one hand, I think that people vote as they did here. More people are voting in reaction to Joe Biden at the moment than they are Donald Trump. I think perhaps one of the best things that happened for the Republicans was that Twitter kicked Trump off. So people weren't hearing from him every 10 minutes on that front, and that was probably helpful on that front. Still, and clearly the objections to Biden, the dysfunction in Washington, the fact that at least here in Virginia, they couldn't even pass the infrastructure bill before the election. None of that helped Terry McAuliffe. So I think Biden was more of a factor than Trump was in this election. And at least at the moment, as people are talking about 2022, that remains the case as well. However, here's the, if there's any hope or optimism that the Democrats have, it's this. It's that the Republican Party in its base is still a Trump party. If you look, that's why I tried to suggest about where Youngkin got most of his votes. His votes came from the Trump base in Virginia. It didn't come from this tremendous swing in the suburbs. That's not where Glenn Youngkin got his votes. Ultimately, he did extraordinarily well, for example, with evangelical voters in Virginia. And so what's likely to happen here, and where the Republicans face their most difficult test, may be with the Senate in 2022. In the Senate, there's a set of Republican primaries that are going on in which Trump-supported candidates look to be favored in these primaries, but may not be favored in the general election. So the Democrats may have some opportunities to hang on in the Senate. The House is a bigger challenge, not only because of the historical tendencies for the party out of the presidency to do well, but because of what I mentioned in terms of redistricting, where at the end of the day, the Republicans are controlling redistricting probably in more states with more seats than the Democrats are controlling redistricting in states like New York and Illinois. So I do believe that as you nationalize things and get closer to 2024, Trump may become more of a factor, and that will become more of a challenge for the Republicans. But at least right now, things look pretty good for them, especially in the House in 2022.
We got a question about endorsements and how much weight endorsements, especially from former governors, have. And we note that our school's namesake, Governor Wilder, did not endorse the Democrat, Terry McAuliffe. What kind of impact do you think that has in voters' minds?
I tend to think endorsements are minimal, really. I mean that they may confirm a position that somebody has or confirm a reservation that some people may have. But by and large, I don't think most voters are waiting for somebody else to tell them, you know, who they're voting for and say, well, that's how I'm going to vote as well. But I tend to think that in general, they're overrated, though I do think at times they've had an impact in national races. I think Jim Clyburn in South Carolina was crucial to Joe Biden getting the nomination for the Democrats as president, winning that state. But by and large, if I look at this race and I look at where the votes were and how they ran, I think that the candidates, their messages, the national environment have more impact than individual endorsements.
You said in your talk that you think Youngkin was clearly the best candidate for the Republicans. He was telegenic. He did a good job of finding the issues that really resonated clearly with the majority of Virginians, and he was able to raise a lot of money. Who would have been the best candidate for the Democrats had they not chosen Terry McAuliffe?
You know, I think that's really an open question, because when you look at this, there's been a lot of concern about McAuliffe being the candidate. But McAuliffe, I think, won every jurisdiction in the Democratic primary. So it's hard to say that the Democrat, that other people didn't have a chance. That he ran, he had far more resources, far more money, far more name recognition than the other candidates had in this election. I don't think Justin Fairfax, because of the lingering questions, whether fair or not, about whether those allegations of sexual assault and rape were valid, had much of a chance. So the question became Jennifer McClellan versus and Jennifer Carol Foy. Both were very different candidates in a number of ways. That Carol Foy was unabashedly the progressive candidate for the Democratic Party. On that front, she ran clearly to the left of McAuliffe in the race. Basically, said the Democrats had been, too cozy with the corporate interests. A lot of people think that is absolute suicide for the Democrats to run further to the left, though I do believe that a populist message to some extent, in which the Democrats stand in favor of the little person against the big people, is not necessarily a bad message for them there. And it was hard for McAuliffe to do that. It might have been easier for somebody like that to run against a hedge fund guy like Glenn Youngkin than McAuliffe did, who's kind of a gazillionaire himself in some ways on that front. Jennifer McClellan is somewhat beloved inside the Democratic Party by a lot of Democratic Party folks who really like her, think she's smart, sharp, would be a great governor. It turned out that she didn't raise a lot of money, and at least her first time around wasn't a great retail politician with the public who didn't know her right now. She spent a lot of time on the campaign trail this time. Maybe next time around, she'll be a far better candidate than she was this time. So again, it's hard for me to say that another Democratic candidate would have been far better, in the sense that I don't know if they would have or not. Maybe it's the case, but maybe they wouldn't have raised anywhere near the amount of money to be competitive. Maybe they wouldn't have had the capacity to do any better in some of these rural areas than Democrats did. But maybe they would have energized the base more than Terry McAuliffe did, who clearly is not a candidate who had that skill, didn't do it very well in 2013, didn't do it very well in 2021. But at the same time, he was the choice of the Democrats in every single jurisdiction in this primary.
You talked about, Dr. Holsworth, the interesting split and very narrow margin, GOP, a few folks, a few delegates ahead on the House side, and the 21-19 margin in favor of the Democrats in the Virginia Senate. Don Boswell asks, do you think that Governor-elect Youngkin will try a Gilmore strategy of taking the Senate by offering some appointments to some of the Democratic senators?
I can imagine that he would, if that makes, if there's an opportunity to do that. The question about that really is related to the workings of the Virginia retirement system. And by and large, if you're under the old retirement system, not the new one, I guess the formula that I would say to just make it easy for people is that if you've been in state service for 30 years, you would get half essentially your final salary as your pension for the rest of your life. There's a little couple of glitches to that explanation, but it's not that bad. And the legislators are in the Virginia retirement system. So if you're in the Virginia retirement system as a legislator and you're making $18,000 and serve 30 years, your pension's $9,000. If, however, you then come in and serve as a state agency head or a deputy director of an agency head and you're making $140,000, your pension for the rest of your life becomes $70,000. And so that's $60,000. If you live 20 years, it's over $1 million. So that's kind of the—
It's attractive.
Yeah. I expect there are a couple of former legislators who might, on the Republican side, who might also want to do this, to come back into the administration and be a public servant again. And that would have some reason to do so. And in the past, there have been a couple of Democrats who have been enticed by that. But you have to find the right Democrat. You have to find someone who's been in public service for long enough that this would make a difference. And you have to find somebody who's willing to do it and who be, and beyond that, needs the money or thinks that the money would be very, very helpful. So I would certainly think they're looking at that, whether they can find that person, because it also has to be in a place that they can win. So the obvious person, actually, that people would look at would be Senator John Edwards in the Roanoke area, who may well lose his seat simply because of redistricting, court-ordered redistricting. Though I might add that he has already taken some very public positions on his Twitter account against some of the stances that the new Attorney General-elect has taken, and it didn't seem like he was angling for a position if you looked at his Twitter account.
So we have just a moment for maybe one more question. There's going to be a lot happening come January. We'll have our new governor. The House has flipped back to Republican control, and chief executives, governors don't always have easy relationships with the legislative branch. What do you look to in this first session in terms of how the new governor can build that relationship, particularly with the House? How does he make his priorities the priorities of the House Republicans?
Well, I think his issue is going to be that on one hand, his priorities, many of his priorities are the priorities of the House Republicans. It's how he was elected. And then secondly, he was elected by the same people in the House that they have in the House. So, for example, in higher education, I would presume that there's going to be substantial dollars that would go into community colleges because those are the folks that the House represents. So there's a lot of opportunities on workforce development, workforce training, community colleges where I think there can be efforts. The challenge for the governor is, and the challenge for the House Republicans is going to be how far do they want to go? That you've heard the House, some Speaker-elect Gilbert basically say, well, I just want to really focus on, things that Virginians care about, the education, prices, transportation, things that aren't heavily ideological. However, there's going to be very substantial members of the House who are going to want to do things that are heavily ideological. And one of the big questions that could potentially come up in Virginia, maybe not in this session, but certainly in the next session, when the Supreme Court makes a decision about Roe v. Wade, and if it turns that back to the states, Virginia, one way or another, is going to have to decide what it's going to do. And as I said, Youngkin is a pro-life governor, very explicitly so, who got elected with huge majorities from white Christian evangelicals who are pro-life. So where does Virginia go on that? And that's an issue that I don't think necessarily comes up as much in this session because I don't think the Supreme Court will have made its decision by that time. Right. But in the second session, those kind of social issues are going to come up. And then, as I said, I think in the K-12 education arena, these issues that were voiced in the campaign, even if the governor would like to de-emphasize them now, are not going away. You have a culture war that is now going to take place in K-12. I believe that is going to continue in a way that will ultimately filter down, as I mentioned, to school board elections and we are probably in for a ride in K-12 education that we haven't seen in a while.
It's certainly going to be an interesting 2022 in Virginia. And Dr. Bob Holsworth, we thank you for all of your insights today. We thank our audience of more than 100 for your many terrific questions and comments. And with that, I will turn it back over to Stevan Dozier, the Wilder Schools Director of Development and Alumni Engagement. Thank you again, Dr. Holsworth.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you, Dr. Holsworth, for a very engaging conversation. Again, we are thankful to all those who were able to attend this month's installment, and we hope that you'll join us in January on the 19th at 12 for our next installment of the Lunch and Learn series. So save the date, and that'll be in the new year. And lastly, I want to say thank you to our communications team behind the scenes who work so hard to make sure these events go smoothly. I want to say thank you to Paula, Dean Gooden, and Dr. Holsworth for putting on such a great event. Everyone have a happy holiday season, and we hope to see you in the new year. Thank you.